So the last time we got on the microphone, we were talking about mental fitness, and a lot's happened since then. You've written another book, and it happens to be about Elon Musk. And I'm curious, what have you learned about Elon Musk's mental fitness, mental toughness at all?
I think he's a really interesting case. Part of what I set off to answer with this book is like, how does he do it? And I actually think mental toughness is a huge part of it. For example, when he started Tesla, he had just made a bunch of money for Sequoia, Mike Moritz. And this guy was one of the greatest venture capitalists working today. He just made a bunch of money with Elon. And Elon's pitching him a car company. And he's like, no, you're crazy. None of these things have worked in the last 100 years, let alone an electric car company. There's no way. And what Moritz said, he's like, I underestimated his grit. I underestimated his mental toughness. I didn't know how far he would go to make this thing work.
And that whole didn't know how far he would go. I mean, if anyone has studied or learned about Elon, this guy is out of control in so many different ways. Because I mean, I remember when I read Walter Isaacson's biopic, and there's that story about how he moved an entire data center that would have taken months in a matter of hours. Something like that, just to flip situations upside down on their head. What did you learn, or how have you downloaded? To reference our last conversation, you kind of put this image in my mind of downloading different softwares and mental models into yours. What do you find from Elon's mindset or his perspective or his mental models? What do you find you're using the most after having written this book?
I mean, I think he is one of the most determined and willful, hard charging people. I mean, he's got just so many lines about this, right? Like, he's just said, I don't give up. I have to be dead or completely incapacitated. If you decide something is important to do, you set off to do it and you keep going or die trying. And there's two elements there that I think are important. One is like that mindset of just dedicating yourself to whatever the mission is that you set out on, rather than spending time wavering and ruminating and thinking about whether it's worth it. The other is choosing what quest to go on in the first place. You know, he goes on these gigantic, purposeful, incredibly important missions, and it becomes very easy to say, yeah, I'll cross any bridge, I'll burn any boat, I'll take any next step that I possibly can, because the juice is worth the squeeze. The mission that I'm on is so big and so noble that it's just obvious that it's worth continuing to try. No matter how slim the odds are, the outcome is so important and the upside is so big that we'll take any chance we can to keep moving forward.
You know, when I was studying Elon, not as deeply as you, but when I was studying, kind of went on down the rabbit hole, one of the frames that really resonated with me, and I've heard you talk about this, is this idea of delete, 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 because you can always add back later. And when you referenced it in the book, it brought me back to the Isaacson biopic, because it was something that helped me focus on efficiency and knowing where the linchpin in a particular procedure is. So this way you could figure out where the leverage is. How did that idea of deleting, adding back later resonate with you?
I think it's huge. And I've experienced it as a CEO. So I lead a publishing company called Scribe Media. We help people write books, many lawyers actually. And we run a whole big process. There's like hundreds of steps that go into writing and publishing a book. And the number of times using these tools that we've been able to just eliminate a step, and it doesn't just like eliminate the step, but it actually, there's 2 or 3 times the value that you invested in the step, that not only do you get that back, but everything else is better. So this feeling of like addition by subtraction, you remove something and everything gets better and smoother and faster, feels like alchemy when you're practicing it. And what's interesting, I think most people look at this giant, factory, this super complex product, and assume it's the result of like a simple idea that's been added to over time, when in fact, almost everything that we use and do is way over complicated, over redundant, over complex. And the things that are most elegant, most efficient, most cost effective, fastest, which means usually another level of kind of efficiency and effectiveness, there's as simple as can possibly be. And so this instinct and ability to focus on deleting things, to your point, until you're forced to add things back in, because otherwise, how do you know? If you haven't failed by over removing, how do you know that you've gone far enough? And it's just so easy to rationalize keeping something in. We're so failure averse, so risk averse, probably in particular in the legal profession, that there's just such an overabundance of boilerplate, paperwork, everything. Actually, there's an interesting story about applying this. So the delete is one of the steps of the algorithm. It's the second step of like his engineering algorithm, which is his process that he runs on these products or processes or steps or organizations entirely in order to improve their efficiency. And one of the things that Tesla was able to do that had never been done before is like one-click car loans or leases. And they did that. The algorithm has 5 steps: question requirements, delete. Number 3, simplify or optimize. Number 4, accelerate cycle time. And number 5 is automate. And most people leap to go faster and try to automate, which is step 4 and 5. And what he emphasizes is like, you've got to question all the requirements, then you've got to try to delete, then you've got to simplify and optimize before you get to trying to speed up or automate, because otherwise you're just adding speed and cost to an inefficient process. And so when he questioned the requirements around all these like pages and pages of auto loans or lease agreements, he found that most of them were added not by regulators, but by just state attorneys or insurance attorneys or anything. And he's like, can we have just like a 2 or 3 sentence loan agreement that they can just like read and click and be done? And everyone's like, I guess. Nobody ever has, but like, you can try. And he's like, great, let's try. So they did. And it like 20x'd their throughput on their e-commerce website for the cars, because it was just so easy and fast compared to these like piles and piles and piles of paperwork from all these different sources, which is like what you go through at a normal dealership.
You know, it's funny that you talk about the audacity behind some of the things that he's built or tried, because being bold is one of the attributes that you talk about in your new book, The Book of Elon. And I'm curious, having written a collection of books that have sold millions of copies, over 5 million, at least one of them at this point, I know. How has that impacted you, your perspective of how you pursue your endeavors, right? You're the CEO of a book publishing company. You're an author yourself. You're an investor. There's all these different layers to who you are as a professional in person. But how has studying these individuals, Balaji, Naval, Elon, list goes on, the people in your network from David Senra, Chris Williamson, Cody Sanchez, list goes on, all these different individuals, how has being in those environments impacted your audacity?
I think Sam Teller was Elon's EA and traveled with him all over the world through some of the craziest times. And he had a great line. I heard him speak a couple of years ago. He said, you can only conceive of the level of excellence you've personally experienced. And I thought that was a really good line, right? It changes how you see the rooms that you're in. You know, it's kind of that old truism of like, you'd rather be the dumbest person in the room rather than the smartest, because that's how you know you're learning the most and like having the most expansion.
Wow.
I mean, Elon's like the most audacious person alive. You know, maybe one of the most high agency, and the ability he has to just sort of see through the perceived limits and question the status quo, not just like, hey, can we do it better, but like, why can't we do this thing that is like the laws of physics are the boundary, and his head is loaded with all this crazy sci-fi stuff, and just nothing, never taking like a 10%, a 20%, a 50%, 100% improvement, like demanding a 10x or 100x improvement to the world. And that's not how most people think, but it does change. And especially when you've seen, you know, I've seen David Senra go from, and Chris Williamson both, like I went on their podcast or they went on mine very, very early on in their careers. And, you know, there's a number of people I've seen go 1,000x, 10,000x in their lives and lifestyles over, you know, 5 or 10 years is unbelievable. And it really changes. It changes what you think of as possible, but it also gives you a really deep appreciation for the price tag, right? Like, I know how hard Chris Williamson and David Senra work. Like, they are absolute animals. and they deserve every ounce of success they had. They take every risk, they take every opportunity to work their face off despite any obstacle, like hard charging at all times, and they do incredible work and they're perfectionists about it, and it's all very well earned. But it does, I don't know, I really do appreciate being in the room for a lot of those, and just like getting a front row seat to some of the stories, because it completely changes what you think of as not just possible, but like normal, right? And gives you a really clear idea of the inputs and the outputs.
I love that approach because it reminds me of two sentiments before we get into the next question. Well, I guess one main one. That product of your environment, who you surround yourself with, how you curate and design your algorithms, your social circles, your workflows, your inputs, and all of those different data points shape the character, the influence, the outcomes that you get in many ways. And getting to those tiers where you have that kind of access and status that also has to be earned naturally. Someone in your position who's as accomplished and committed to process and discovery and in following intellectual curiosity in the ways that you do, while also inspiring and informing others with enforced evidence, I think has, been a product of your ambition and audacity, just having studied your career and seen what you've done. But what it reminds me of is a sentiment that a friend of mine, 4-time founder, 4 exits, like savage human athlete all around. He talks about networking a lot when he gives keynotes and seminars. And he says that he judges his relationships based on who someone is willing to introduce them to within their network. So how highly he will value a relationship is contingent on like, oh, you're willing to introduce me to the highest value person in your network, or your perceived value of that person within your network. That helps me understand where I fall within your ecosystem and your situation. And so like being in those environments, having all that kind of influence in how it shapes your ambition. I mean, talk about 1000x, right? You're part of that same product or that same experience, right? Where your career has really catapulted over the last decade plus, and rightfully so, because of how you wrote a book on Naval, and now he's writing the forward for this book, and you didn't know Naval before that, right? So it's like, and it took him a minute to, I think, get in touch with, or for you guys to get in touch before or after you had written the book, pardon me if the chronology is a little bit off. But yeah, it just reminds me of those couple of things.
No, you got it. Yeah, it is. I didn't set out to do it, but it turns out if you write a really good book about somebody, it's a lot easier to meet them.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I don't really. I don't intentionally network. I just kind of follow my curiosity and bounce around and build some amazing relationships with people that I hope to remain friends with for life. Like that's and that I just feel privileged to like work among and try to contribute to.
Yeah, well, it's well deserved, man. And I think like on that note, one of my favorite podcasts is Senra and Chris Williamson going on. I think it was I've re-listened to it a couple times. It's like 20, if you haven't heard it, you definitely should. Like 50 truths or 20 truths that, I'll send it to you, but it's between them two.
I believe I introduced Senra and Williamson.
Oh, did
so
you?
I think that episode was the outcome of that.
Wow, that makes me so happy. Back. That's so cool. Yeah. Anyway, I digress. So anyway, I'm hanging out last night with my daughter, and we're watching some basketball, and I take out your book. I'm like looking at a couple more things that I had highlighted, underlined. But when you sent me the book, autographed copy, by the way, I appreciate that very much, going right next to the copy of the Almanac of Naval Ravikant. You sent it with a couple Post-its for us to talk about. But because she's also a curious little girl, she took out one of the Post-its. And so I lost the place on one of them. And I had her put it back somewhere else in the book. And so we're going to go to where she put it. So this way we could talk about that particular point. And then we're going to get into something else. So of course
cool.
she will.
How old is she?
She's 2.
She's 2. I love it. I love it. And this is a fantastic test of a book and an author, actually. Is like, can you open the book to a random page and find valuable information? Like that's a bar that I hope my books pass. So we'll see. Let's do it.
In my experience, it is, and the book I'm writing has the same standard that I'm holding myself. It's like a Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People, same kind of dynamic where you could just open it up anywhere and see that it adds value. So the question, what would you say is your most core skill? Answer, I don't worship anything, but I devote myself to the advancement of humanity using technology. What does that part mean to you? Has it resonate with you? And thank you to my beautiful daughter for highlighting the importance of advancing human and technology interrelationships.
I think people sort of mistake Elon as like an entrepreneur first or a businessman first. I think he's actually, everything that he's done comes from this like very deep philosophical worldview about growing humanity as a civilization and expanding consciousness and just understanding more of the universe. And he sort of says that the way to do this is like the bottleneck to doing this is actually engineering more so than it is raw science, at least at this point. Like, we need to engineer the particle accelerators in order to understand anything. We need to engineer, better chips in order to have AI that can help us run more science experiments. Like the bottleneck is more so what we can build. And as we expand that, like push those boundaries of what is possible and what has been built, we will gradually come to understand more of the universe and we'll have a more resilient civilization. That's his whole goal for making us multiplanetary, is just if an asteroid comes by or if there's a plague or World War III or something that imperils Earth, that we've got a second colony, basically, second human colony on Mars, and maybe the moon and maybe other places as well. That sounds so grandiose, but it's also, who's on the other side of that argument, right? Like, who's like, no, we should have a single point of failure for as long as possible for all of life as we know it, right? I think it's our responsibility as, the conscious beings on this planet to be good stewards. Like the ultimate environmentalism is actually like back up the biosphere, protect all forms of life as we know it. We can't put the penguins in charge of our space program as much as we love them. Like we're the ones who are qualified for the job. So let's get it done.
It's funny that you say it like that because the expanding of the human consciousness brings me back to another idea. He talks about it all the time, but brings me back to this other idea about when he was, and you reference it in the book also, reading A Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy when he was younger, and how he kind of had this midlife crisis at 14, 15 years old whenever he was reading it about, asking the computer, what's the answer to life, and it spits back 42. And really it's, if the universe is the answer, what's the right question? And so we're not asking the right questions, better answers. And so the quality of those questions dictate the quality of our life. And so when you learn at a very young age that it's less about the solution and more about what kind of questions you're asking to get to that next step. I mean, I talk about this in my seminars all the time. I think about it all the time. Instead of like, I want to be more present or I want to be a great dad and being intentional about those things. I even, published something about it yesterday. Like, it's, for me, how do I want my daughters to remember me or to feel my impact or to know that I was here or to appreciate our relationship? Like, how can I ask a better question than like, oh, I want to be a good dad? And so that kind of reminds me of that sentiment where it brings me into the next question around feedback loops, because that's where Elon, and at least where I resonate with Elon most, is curating a feedback loop that's geared towards action. You also talk about this in the book where he tries to focus on criticizing the action and not the person. And so how do you design a feedback loop or build a feedback loop that helps you iterate to improve rather than like take things personally and overanalyze?
Yeah, there's a lot of good practical things in there. I think as on an individual basis or as like a team leader or a business, owner, there is a lot about feedback loops at a few different levels. So one, like reality is the ultimate teacher, right? And so you want to run as many tests or experiments as you possibly can. So your iteration speed, your ability to observe what happened, what is reality teaching you, and then adjust and run a different experiment. And that's what you see Tesla doing with autopilot. That's what you see SpaceX doing with Starship. Like, they're trying to build as many demos or prototypes or test programs as they can and blow them up with as much measurement as they can so they can figure out the reason that it blew up and then solve that reason and find another reason. But you can't do that if you have, especially on an individual basis, if you have too high of an ego, right? Like, there's so many people who are like in denial of what reality is trying to tell them, and they're just making the same mistake over and over again rather than sort of observing what's actually happening. And Elon is famous for, let's say, like very direct feedback. You can go in the Isaacson biography or in, there's a book that's like just all of Musk's memos. It's like a bunch of emails and stuff that he wrote. And he's like very unambiguous communication. He's very clear. And to the point where many people would probably be like, why are you such an asshole? And he's like, I'm just being really clear. I try to never insult a person, but I'm like really clear with where the expectations are and when they are not met. And that's what he said. He says, I give people hardcore feedback, and what that looks like is often is a story of an engineer who came in and like didn't know they call it the idiot index, but basically like the margin that they were paying on each of the parts in his system,
the knowledge gap around it.
Yeah, like the engineer who was in charge of the system did not know what were the most efficient and least efficient parts. And, I think it's maybe they knew what they cost, but not what the margin was. And he's like, Elon, so I think this is a verbatim quote, at least according to the source. I remember reading, and this is off the top of my head, but like, I expect you to know at all times your best and worst part and everything in between, like which are your most efficient, which are your least efficient. You have failed quite badly in this meeting. Come back tomorrow, know this information. If you don't, your resignation will be accepted. Super clear, super high speed, sounds like an asshole. But like, that engineer figured it out, came back, knew the stuff. They never talked about it again. And he went on to have a great career. So, and like, I remember somebody, I think this was Isaacson, like tried to close the loop and like asked him like 2 weeks later, did he even remember saying that? And he was like, no, like, that was not like an out of the ordinary thing. And so I think this is like, there's stories of Steve Jobs that like, what feels curt and almost inhuman, I think, to like normal people who spend most of their time trying to make the people around them happy or comfortable is just like, when you are a leader of one of these organizations, it is your job to be the guardian of the standards. And you are doing this hundreds and hundreds of times per day. There's just like a clarity, and you have to develop this sort of, callous to the emotion and emotionally how this thing is being received. Like it is your job to hold the bar. And I like to think of it, or describe it at least, as like empathy at the level of the mission versus empathy at the level of the individual. And that feels really different and really hard. But, if you're responsible for hundreds of millions of dollars of investment and thousands of other employees and all these different projects, like you can't, if you are overly soft on, 1% or 10% or 50% of people who aren't meeting expectations, you're not doing anybody else a service. You are harming way more people. And it's so hard to remember that and act on that on a, minute to minute basis as a leader. But that's usually in the highest functioning organizations, you'll find somebody who is almost perpetually able to kind of stay in that state of mind.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Inside the Inspired. My name is Jonathan Cohen, and I have a quick favor to ask you. If you're getting any value out of this content, please take a second to subscribe to the channel. You help us reach more people, and you can also stay up to date with all the latest content coming your way. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll catch you in the episode.
It's funny because the more I have gone through the book and thought about like Elon's impact on society at large and his mission, there's a great like Sean Ryan short about how, I don't know if you've seen it, but I forget who he's interviewing, crypto guy, I believe, about Elon's mission to get to Mars. And he's showing like the Cybertrucks on Mars. He's showing the humanoid robots on Mars. He's talking about the battery-powered cells on Mars. He's talking about all these different things. And I never talk about these things on the podcast, but that ability to think in a bigger picture, grander scope, and have a vision for what the future looks like and build things towards that vision. And, I believe the whole beginning of the book is about vision and crafting your own vision, and how you offer all these different mental models and frames that people can test to see if designing a vision within the scope of those frames and their value to society and discovering their value to society can work. What, if any, resonate with you, or do you think could help someone that may be struggling with crafting a vision for their life at any season of life?
God, yeah. I mean, I think the subtitle of this book is A Guide to Purpose and Success. And so I think it's obvious that Elon Musk is a very effective person. And what I didn't actually know until I started writing the book and just sort of discovered through the process is that he's also one of the most sort of purpose-driven, and that everything he does, and part of the reason he's able to perform at the level he does and accrue the investment and the talent and the fan base that he has, is because he's so purpose-driven, and he's passed over and over again these incredibly conspicuous sort of tests that the universe has sort of given him to be like, how dedicated to this are you? And he's unique in that. I can't name other entrepreneurs who have risked 9 figures of personal net worth and public humiliation to keep their dreams alive, their missions going. And throughout this book, it's sort of, if you are one of these people, and I know many people who are in this sort of crisis of meaning of like, I don't know, I don't quite have the same level of blind patriotism. I don't have quite the same level of like faith in the institutions at any level. I don't know. AI is kind of making me a little less sure of my future career path. Less people are starting families, or at least doing it much later. And so there's like this uncertainty of meaning is coming for a lot of people, I think, whether it's personal or professional or spiritual. And Elon is not often thought of as like a spiritual, sort of like a meaning thought leader, but I actually think he is. And I think there's things in this book that, missions that are put forth, whether it's risks to humanity or dreams for the future, that are absolutely worth dedicating your life to solving. And I think, we're all heavily impacted by the books we read when we're, in our teens and early 20s, and that affects where we choose to go to school, and the majors we choose, and the careers we look into, and the jobs we want to take, and the companies we want to work at. And Elon's North Star, he says at the very beginning, he's like, I just take the set of actions most likely to make the future good. And I think that, combined with like a rigorous kind of entrepreneurship and engineering mind, has driven him where he is. Like, I think he's uniquely brilliant, but he's not superhuman. And many, many, many people could reach incredible heights of meaning, purpose, and financial success by following in his footsteps in a general sense, which is just like trying to build something to solve a problem for humanity that it has not solved yet. And Naval has a couple of great lines about this. I love the places where like Naval and Elon overlap, right? Like Naval says, if you want to get rich, find a way to give society something it wants, but does not yet know how to get at scale. And, Elon is going to end up a trillionaire because he's given us things that we didn't even know we wanted, right? We didn't even know we needed reusable rockets. We didn't know we needed orbital data centers. We didn't know that a fleet of autonomous taxis or humanoid robots was even like a possibility. Most people felt these things were probably hundreds of years away, not possible within our lifetimes with sufficient effort. So I hope that, breaks those perceived limitations that so many people have. Like, I think, and many people closer to the frontiers are now saying, we're going to cure cancer in the next 10, 20 years. Some people are saying we'll cure all disease in the next 10 to 20 years because of how AI and genetics and science are sort of interacting with each other. But Naval, I recently had a conversation with Naval to update the audio version of the Almanac of Naval, and added like 3 or 4 hours of new information. And he said something that blew my mind. which is like in nature, it just as in the economy, the majority of creatures are actually parasites, like versus creatures that sort of get their own energy from the environment, right? And I thought that was so interesting, and just a really interesting way to look at the world. And so if you think of, all the people sort of living their life as economic parasites versus like truly building something or creating a service or caring for someone else, generating net new value, like, and I have a sense that people have a relationship with themselves in their subconscious based on their knowledge of themselves, and that people are sort of who are chronically depressed or unhappy have some sort of like repressed knowledge that they're actually not doing very much good for other people, and that they've just consciously or subconsciously come to terms with it, but they've like transformed that into some, psychological or physical manifestation of unhappiness, and just exercising that and revisiting some of these, potential ways to unambiguously be of use to humans now and in the future. Like, we live in safety and comfort because of generations of sacrifice and effort that came before us. And I feel like we owe it to the future to do everything we can to keep that going.
I mean, just going off of that and the frame, I love how you address that conversation with Naval too, but like going back to the feedback loop point and then using not the litmus test or the other framework of Elon sharing, how can I be useful today if you don't know where to start? And that utility lens, for me at least, is a guide to provide directional certainty. Where if you're unsure about what kind of impact you want to have, it's how can I be of service? How can I give? One of the best questions that I learned how to stop asking was, how can I make more money? And it started to be, who can I serve? Who can I help? How can I give? Because when you give, it makes room for more to come in. And so that ability to focus on utility and focus on how you can give, you hear everyone kind of talk about it. Those are kind of two main, at least, in the personal growth space, giving and action. And so when you focus on those two main pillars, you can accomplish so much because you're focused on making things happen and you're thinking of yourself less. And so you're using that finite amount of bandwidth you have to create and to serve. And so even if it's not necessarily, a humanoid taxi robot fleet going to Mars, it's a starting point that can put you on a platform to start guiding a conversation in a productive way and building a feedback loop that's objectively focused on the action. And that's why a lot of what you wrote and compiled resonates with me in this book, because it starts off with vision. It starts off with that fundamental layer. And so to your earlier point about how he's not like, a personal growth type of influencer dude, he's someone who genuinely is following a vision and building something of utility, rooted in utility and rooted in how to make things better. But it's funny because I just finished reading Ryan Holiday's Wisdom Takes Work. I don't know if you had a chance to check it out or have heard about it a lot at all. But he has a chapter in there about Elon, and he's kind of tearing him apart, where it's about, here's all the good he's done, but at the same time, like, this is not an example of wisdom. This is an example of like what not to do in many ways, because your brain, and I'm sure if, Ryan Holiday was listening to this, he'd be like, you're not paraphrasing it the right way. But I'm going to share what I got out of it and distill it as much as I possibly can. My takeaway from it, and please respond based on, my takeaway, not Ryan's. I'll leave it for you two to kind of, go about it in your different thought leader, thought authority type of ways. My takeaway from it was that as much as he's an intellectual and as much as he has done for society, there are so many childish, misguided actions that this individual has taken, where there's like this clear need for validation. There's this clear impulsiveness around certain things that he does that lack discipline, that are not focused, that don't follow those same themes. And he resorts to that quote about his mind being a storm, and the like I was saying, the lack of discipline around some of the things that he shares and does. And is that really the path you want to go down? Is that really wisdom in action, right? Because he's such a smart guy, but at the same time, there's these not so smart things that he does. So I'm kind of curious on the other side of all these positive, amazing things that Elon Musk has done. We're all pretty hyper aware of the critique in the media. How is it kind of balancing the investigation and research around such a storied and accomplished individual, but also recognizing the downfall about some of the attributes?
I think every strength has its sort of complementary weakness, right? Like in each of us, or in any like outlier of history. The frame there is that like Elon should act like Ryan thinks he should act. I don't know that I agree with that. Like, I think Elon is just being authentically Elon. And like, does that include impulsive behavior? Yeah, for sure. Does it include like kind of an interesting mix of like childish naivety and like megalomaniacal execution? Yeah. But like, that's him. If he was like this enlightened Zen dude, he wouldn't have the pedal down at 6 different companies and be like driving us forward. And if he was, this measured sort of risk averse, stalwart example of stoic dignity and high character leadership, he would not be max risk on betting his net worth on multiple companies at the same time. And like, you can't criticize a fish for not climbing a tree. I think that's like basically what's happening. And you can like or dislike Elon Musk. You can respect or disrespect him, any of the individual things he's done. I don't write this book to say you should go be him. You couldn't if you tried, right? Like, he's an extremely unique mix of nature and nurture and an early start and all these things. But I think his lived experience has produced some really fascinating tools that are useful for almost anybody. I don't think anybody reads, the great biographies are like almost by definition of people so weird and crazy that like they're not good examples. You go through the whole Founders archive and you listen to 400 episodes and you're like, there's like maybe 3 lives I'd actually envy in here. And like most of them are cautionary tales, even though they're some of the greatest and most accomplished people alive. But I also know Ryan. I don't know him personally. I admire a lot of his work, but I also know that he spends a lot of time sort of politically opposed to some of the things that Elon's done. So I don't know the timing or the context of when that critique was written, but I just think, I don't know. I try not to like project my values on anybody there. And I think what I would say to somebody who's like, especially if you're deeply anti Elon Musk, you probably didn't make it this far. But if you know somebody in your life who is, the test I would give you is just, give somebody this book, and I'll share a story in a moment, but like the test of this book is just put this book in front of somebody, open to a random page, start reading, and say, just like circle any sentence you disagree with. Like, you can, a lot of what people think they don't like about him is usually from headlines written by political opponents, basically. And they're not particularly well informed. And I get these people in my comments like all the time who come in real hot with something that they think I don't know, even though I just spent 5 years like studying this person. Because he's one of the most famous people alive with, hundreds of millions of enemies politically, which is really unfortunate. But there's been a few cases, like an editor who worked with me on this book. His name is Dylan. He's an awesome guy. He's like working on his own book. And his dad was really pissed when he found out he was working on this, because he was sort of in that headspace of like, Elon's a bad guy. He's like, he's just trying to make money. Maybe he's like not a good engineer or whatever. And it took him a while to like sort of warm up to the idea at all. And then eventually Dylan put like just one page of this book in front of him. Was like, just read this one page. Just read one page and just see if you agree with it. So he read one page and he didn't hate it. And like 2 weeks later, he gave him another page and it's like, okay, I don't hate this either. And he did end up reading the whole book, and he read the whole book, and he's like, I don't agree with him on everything, but I certainly I can separate and I can respect him as an entrepreneur and an engineer and a visionary, and still disagree with, some of the positions that he's taken or the actions that he's taken. And that's a totally sane, smart, rational, nuanced thing that's how all of our opinions actually should be. Like enlightened society, I think. And he did go out and bought a Tesla, and he loves it. And so that's the I love that story, and it gave me such warmth and hope for just nuance and conversation and appreciation of exactly this kind of type, right?
It's so important to have that mindfulness around the things you do and don't agree with, because of that compartmentalization, like how you appreciate someone's contributions, but at the same time, you don't have to agree with everything that they have to say. And I think that, I did my best to synthesize what I took away from that chapter of Ryan's book. I believe it was published within the last year, so it's fairly recent. And I likewise also admire much of Ryan's work. It's informed a lot of my worldview and perspective, but I definitely disagreed with, in a healthy way, disagreed with the posture he took on Elon in that respect, because, especially in that book where there's so many examples of, I think what Ryan Holiday's work has done a very, very good job of is open up the conversation around how we have romanticized certain heroes in history, and they're actually extremely fallible, whether it's Abraham Lincoln or otherwise. He does a very good job of opening up that conversation. He did it with Aristotle or Socrates, I think, in the book as well, talking about how society viewed them at their respective peaks within their careers, and everything that kind of happened. It really opened up my eyes to oh, they're human, and that's okay, and that's cool, and it actually makes it super relatable. I know you're a very busy man. I want to be conscious and respectful of your time. The last time you were on this podcast, we closed out by me asking you about, what the future version of yourself from 10 years from now would offer you as advice in order to get there. But I'm going to kind of switch it up on the fly. And
I wonder what I said.
And you're going to have to listen back and see. But kind of following that same theme, knowing what you know now, kind of consulting this mental board of advisors and some actual advisors that you've had the pleasure of writing about and connecting with. What question or questions, if you had to distill it down to 1 to 3, do you think someone who wants to get somewhere in their mind's eye, their vision, what question or questions can they ask themselves to help manage their stress, hone their burnout, cultivate resilience, build a vision? What kind of questions do you think someone can ask themselves in order to get to that ideal spot?
This is wonderful because it's so easy. What is the most important thing to be working on right now? And why am I not working on it? But that is my number one takeaway from Elon, basically, is that he's doing he's working on the most important thing, which is usually the bottleneck to progress, at the right time, which is immediately, with great intensity, and he's putting a huge dent in it. And so I think that is a generalizable thing. No matter what your goal is in life, bring urgency and intensity to moving that thing forward, and just constantly be true. Most of us are just going through the fucking motions all the time. We're showing up at the meeting that's on the calendar. We're going to the thing that we get invited to. We're answering the phone call that comes in. We're looking at the inbox and triaging what comes in. And if you don't flip and decide what is the most important thing to you, is it getting married? Is it having a kid? Is it building a side hustle that can pull you out of your job? Is it advancing in your job? Is it leaving the field entirely? Is it finding a mission to dedicate yourself to? Is it becoming enlightened? Is it being healthier? Retiring your parents? I don't care what the thing is that is your goal, but what is the single most important thing to be working on right now, and why are you not working on it? This is how Richard Hamming talks to scientists who are like, do you want a Nobel Prize or do you not? What's the most important question in your field, and why aren't you working on it? This is how Elon treats his engineers. And this is how I think people who are fulfilled at the end of their lives treat their personal lives. If the most important thing to you in the world is getting married and having a kid, do not delay your dating life until some hypothetical future level of, career success. I see people doing that all over the place. Like there's nobody that regrets an incremental kid that I'm aware of. Like, so that's like starting a family super, super late in life has come back to bite many people that I know too. So, life is short, but you can really cover a lot of ground if you work with intensity on the most important thing to you at any given time. And as I look back, my regrets, such as they are, which I generally don't hold, but like the things that I would tell myself are all around like you delayed on an important opportunity, and I'm working on getting better at that going forward.
Eric, you're a gentleman, a scholar, an awesome author, and just one of the coolest dudes I had the pleasure of knowing. Thank you so much for round 2 of hopping on the podcast. Please let the audience know where they can keep up with your work and get a copy of your new book, The Book of Elon.
It's very kind of you. Thank you. All of my personal stuff is at my website, ejorgenson.com. I got a newsletter, podcast, bunch of blog posts. You can link to my books from there. We got a small venture fund where I invest in crazy people, hopefully building Elon scale successes at the earliest stages. And all the stuff about the book is elonmuskbook.org. And if you want, you can read it there for free. I give away the digital versions of all my books. And you're also welcome to, obviously anywhere you buy books.
Appreciate you. Thank you so much. If you got any value out of this episode, please rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Once again, my name is Jonathan Cohen, and this is Inside the Inspired.
Thanks for going inside me.